The ward was quiet, except for the low hum of machines and the occasional shuffle of nurses' shoes against polished floors. It was a place where suffering was common, but so was resilience. Patients came and went, each with stories written across their bodies in bruises, scars, and bandages. Yet when she arrived, carried in on a stretcher, with her face pale and her body bound in layers of white cloth, the atmosphere shifted. Something about her presence unsettled the air, like a secret too heavy to stay hidden. She did not speak. Not when the doctors asked her name. Not when the nurses whispered questions about family or pain levels. Not even when they probed her wounds, changed her dressings, or adjusted the four that dripped life back into her veins. She kept her lips pressed together, her eyes closed most of the time, and her breathing steady, so steady that even in her fragility, it seemed controlled. Wordless, she entered their world, and wordless, she stayed. For the staff, silence was not unusual. Many patients arrived in shock, too overwhelmed by trauma to talk. But with her, it was different. Silence was not born of fear or weakness, it was deliberate. Even as she lay broken, she radiated something the others could not name. Nurses exchanged looks over her bed. Other patients whispered in their corners. "She looks like she's been through hell," one muttered. "Maybe she doesn't remember anything," another guessed. But deep down, they all knew her silence was not emptiness. It was choice. Days turned into weeks, and still, she did not utter a sound. The nurses tried everything: gentle small talk, jokes, reassurances. She would only nod faintly or shake her head when needed. Her eyes, however, told more than words ever could. They scanned every corner of the ward, memorizing routines, exits, even the way shadows shifted across the floor at different times of day. She never looked lost. She looked alert, observing, calculating. At first, the other patients pitied her. They saw her silence and assumed it meant brokenness. Many had arrived in the ward shattered after all, and they projected their own fragility onto her. Yet soon, their pity shifted to something else. One man, himself recovering from a car accident, noticed how she never let her posture collapse, even when pain racked her body. "You'd think she'd let herself rest," he murmured to a fellow patient. "But look, she sits like a soldier, even in bed." Another woman, struggling to learn to walk again, noticed how the silent patient practiced every small movement with care, as though each gesture was a drill rather than therapy. Slowly, the whispers grew louder. "She's not ordinary." At night, when the ward fell into stillness, she did not sleep like the others. She rested lightly, her breathing calm, but her body never slackened into vulnerability. Once, a nurse accidentally dropped a tray nearby, and while every patient startled clumsily, she reacted with startling precision. Her eyes snapped open, her body tensed instantly, and her hand moved toward her bandaged side as though reaching for something absent. In that moment, the nurse froze, tray rattling in her hands, realizing she was not dealing with a helpless woman. She was dealing with someone trained. Someone who had lived in environments where sudden noise meant danger, not clumsiness. Despite her injuries, she seemed in control of her own suffering. When pain surged, she didn't cry out. Instead, she slowed her breathing, adjusting it rhythmically, mastering her body the way only a professional could. The doctors assumed she had a high pain tolerance, but the truth was deeper. She had discipline forged in hardship, the kind that teaches one to endure the unbearable without breaking. Her silence began to intrigue the ward. People who had dismissed her as broken now found themselves drawn to her. Some tried harder to engage, eager to uncover her secret. A curious young nurse left magazines by her bedside, wondering if she'd respond. She didn't. A volunteer offered to read aloud. She simply closed her eyes, listening silently, but never acknowledging the effort. Even when another patient, a war veteran, attempted conversation about battles and wounds, she only met his words with a level, unreadable gaze. What unsettled people most was not her silence, but the strength hidden within it. She was wordless, yes, but never weak. When the therapists guided her through basic recovery routines, she followed instructions with eerie precision. While others faltered, she executed each movement exactly as told, even if pain carved lines into her face. She never wasted motion, never made an error. It was as if she had trained for this, not the injury itself, but the process of rising again. The therapists noticed it too. One remarked, "She learns faster than anyone I've seen. It's like she already knows what we're teaching her." Another nodded, "She holds herself differently. Look at her balance, even though she's weak." That's not random, that's practice. Yet she gave them nothing in return. No explanation, no backstory, no words. Only silence. And the silence became its own story. Rumors circulated. Some believed she was a soldier who'd lost her unit and her will to speak. Others thought she might have been a spy, trained to endure without revealing anything. A few whispered darker theories, that she was escaping from something, hiding in her silence, because words would expose her. No one knew the truth, and she wasn't telling. Still, despite the rumors, she began to inspire those around her. A patient who had lost his leg in an accident said, "If she can hold herself like that, I can stand straighter too." A woman battling depression after surgery whispered, "She doesn't even complain. Maybe I shouldn't either." Unknowingly, through her silence, she was teaching everyone something valuable. Resilience is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and relentless. The doctors eventually stopped pushing her to speak. The nurses, though curious, respected her silence. The other patients, once suspicious, began to admire her. Yet beneath the admiration, there remained one lingering question no one could shake. Who was she, really? Because in every small gesture, in the way she carried pain, in the sharpness of her eyes, in the precision of her movements, she betrayed a history too deep to stay buried. She was not just a patient. She was something more, something unspoken. And while the world around her waited for words, she guarded them, knowing they were not yet needed. Her silence was not weakness, it was her shield. A shield that would one day crack open the truth. But for now, in the dim ward filled with whispers and wonder, she remained what she had been since the moment she arrived, wounded and wordless. The days stretched into weeks, and though her wounds slowly knit together under the careful watch of doctors, her silence remained untouched. She lived in the rehabilitation ward, as though she were a shadow passing through present, but elusive, a figure who could be seen, but not truly known. To the casual eye, she was just another patient in recovery, a woman mending broken flesh and bone. Yet for those who paid closer attention, there was something off-kilter about her stillness. It wasn't the stillness of someone numbed by trauma. It was the calculated restraint of someone choosing silence. The nurses began to notice her habits first. They saw the way she refused to accept help unless absolutely necessary. When food trays arrived, she adjusted her body with painful precision to sit upright and feed herself, despite trembling hands. She never complained when treatments burned like fire, or when therapy left her trembling with fatigue. She endured it all with an unnerving composure. One nurse muttered under her breath, "She's too controlled for someone in her state." Another whispered in reply, "Maybe she's just strong." But deep down, both knew this wasn't ordinary strength. Her fellow patients observed her too. In a ward filled with small talk, groans, and restless chatter, she stood apart. They noticed how she avoided the easy camaraderie that often forms among those sharing pain. When they laughed together at silly jokes, she simply watched. When they vented frustrations about long recoveries, she kept her eyes down, expression unreadable. It wasn't rudeness, it was distance, a wall that separated her from everyone else. And yet, paradoxically, her very detachment drew their attention. One patient, a retired firefighter with burns crawling across his arms, made a game of studying her. He remarked one evening, "She doesn't flinch. Not once, even when they dig into her stitches. That's not normal." Another, an elderly veteran with a prosthetic leg, added quietly, "That's training. Trust me, I've seen it. She's been somewhere and done things she won't talk about." The others leaned in, eager for gossip, but the veteran just shook his head. "You don't get eyes like that for nothing. Those are the eyes of someone who's had to watch everything." Indeed, her eyes betrayed her more than anything else. They were restless without being frantic, always moving with a kind of intent. She never simply looked, she assessed. When a nurse wheeled in equipment, her gaze lingered on its parts, scanning as though cataloging every detail. When a visitor walked through the ward, her eyes flicked first to their hands, then to their stance, then to the bag they carried. She mapped rooms without stepping into them, memorized patterns without writing them down, and studied people as if every movement mattered. It was not the habit of someone idle. It was the survival instinct of someone who had lived where mistakes cost lives. At night, the silence deepened. Most patients, exhausted by pain and medication, surrendered to heavy sleep. But she did not. She rested lightly, her breaths calm, her body still. Yet the staff noticed her eyes would often open at the smallest disturbance. The shift of curtains, the click of shoes in the hallway, the faint squeak of a cartwheel. She slept like someone who had learned long ago that true rest was a luxury rarely afforded. And though she spoke no words, fragments of her past seemed to slip through in other ways. Once, during a physical therapy session, the trainer instructed her to focus on balance exercises. Without hesitation, she adjusted her stance with a soldier's disciplined feet placed firmly, knees bent just enough to absorb shock, shoulders squared. The therapist blinked, taken aback. "You've done this before," he remarked. She only tilted her head slightly, expression blank, but the precision of her posture answered for her. Another time, while attempting simple grip strength routines, she performed them with such perfect rhythm that the therapist's curiosity got the better of him. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. Her silence was her reply, but her steady execution betrayed the truth. This was not new. Her muscles remembered drills her tongue refused to speak of. Rumors began to grow among the staff. Some whispered that she was ex-military, a soldier who had endured something too harrowing to share. Others speculated she was in witness protection, hiding from enemies by keeping her past sealed shut. A few even romanticized the mystery, calling her the ghost in the ward, a survivor whose story was too dangerous for words. But beneath the speculation, there was a deeper effect at play. Her silence began to shape those around her. The other patients, once inclined to complain, started to catch themselves when they saw her endure pain wordlessly. They began sitting straighter, pushing harder in therapy, holding their emotions in check. The staff, too, worked differently when near her, more cautious, more respectful, as though aware they were in the presence of someone who had carried burdens heavier than they could imagine. Despite all this, loneliness clung to her. Behind the mask of discipline and restraint, there lingered a heaviness no one could penetrate. When she thought no one was watching, her eyes softened with the ache of memories pressing against her silence. Sometimes, her hand would drift unconsciously to the scars beneath her gown, her fingers tracing them with a mix of sorrow and familiarity, as though each wound carried a story only she could remember. One evening, as the ward settled into its nighttime hush, the elderly veteran wheeled closer to her bed. His voice was low, roughened by years of hardship. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," he said gently. "But I know what you're doing." You're carrying more than your own pain." She looked at him, then really looked, as if weighing whether he deserved a piece of her guarded truth. For a moment, it seemed she might speak. Her lips parted, breath catching in her throat. But then, with the faintest shake of her head, she closed the door again. The veteran only nodded, as if he understood. He had once lived inside the same silence. And so her past remained hidden, locked away behind sealed lips and watchful eyes. But even unspoken, it bled into the ward. Her silence became a language in itself, a language of resilience, of discipline, of survival. Though she never uttered a word, she was already telling a story to anyone who cared enough to see it. The others could only guess at the details. They could only imagine what kind of training, what kind of life, had carved such control into her bones. But one truth was undeniable. She was not merely a patient in recovery. She was a warrior in disguise, a woman who carried her history like a shadow stitched to her very being. And though she gave them nothing to confirm it, the silence itself was proof enough. For silence, in her case, was not emptiness. It was protection. It was the shield of someone who had lived a past too heavy to be spoken aloud. The ward had developed a rhythm by then. Nurses came and went with trays of medication. Therapists guided patients through monotonous exercises, and the hum of medical machinery filled the silences between conversations. For her, those silences were not gaps to be filled, but a natural state. She drifted through them like a ghost, watchful and withdrawn, still refusing to speak a single word. By now, her silence had become her signature, the defining mystery of her presence. It was into this quiet world that he arrived, a new medic assigned to assist with rehabilitation. He carried himself differently from the other staff, his presence commanding without trying. Tall, broad-shouldered, and sun-weathered, he bore the unmistakable look of someone shaped by more than clinics and classrooms. The other nurses introduced him simply as Jake, but among themselves they whispered, "Former Navy SEAL." To most patients, that introduction was a source of intrigue. Some admired him instantly. Others felt comforted by his quiet confidence. But to her, the silent woman, his arrival was something else entirely. She didn't flinch when he stepped into the ward, didn't shift uncomfortably under his gaze. Instead, her eyes followed him with the same sharpness she gave to every detail, measuring him in the way only a fellow survivor could. And he noticed. From the first day, Jake saw what others had missed. He wasn't distracted by her silence or the rumors surrounding it. Instead, he studied her body language the way he had once studied teammates in combat zones. Her breathing was measured, not random. She wasn't merely enduring pain, she was regulating it, controlling each inhale and exhale as though every breath was part of a drill. When she shifted in bed, her movements were deliberate, economical, never wasted. And when she struggled to rise for therapy, he saw the subtle way her eyes scanned her surroundings before taking her first step. These were not the habits of a civilian. These were the instincts of someone trained. He didn't say anything at first. Observation was second nature to him, honed through years of reading people and environments where trust meant survival. Instead, he quietly joined her sessions, offering support when necessary, but never pressing too hard. He adjusted her routines with subtle changes, adding challenges others wouldn't notice. A slightly longer balance hold, a slower resistance drill, a step that required more focus than usual. And each time, she responded with precision, not the fumbling progress of an average patient, but the refined execution of someone whose body remembered discipline. The staff praised her progress, remarking on her natural ability. "She's a fast learner," one therapist said. But Jake knew better. She wasn't learning, she was remembering. It wasn't long before he began to test her more directly. During one exercise, he deliberately shifted the weight unexpectedly, a common trick used in military training to assess reflexes under pressure. To the untrained, it would have caused a stumble or collapse. But she reacted instantly, her core tightening, knees bending just enough to catch herself with flawless control. She didn't even look startled. She simply steadied herself and continued as if nothing had happened. Jake's eyes narrowed. That reaction was muscle memory, honed through repetition under stress. He had seen it before in men and women who had endured the grueling conditioning of combat training. Later, while adjusting her bandages, he noticed more signs. The placement of scars. The old bruises that spoke of impacts not caused by accidents, but by intense physical demands. They were not random injuries. They were the remnants of a body pushed past normal limits. For the first time, Jake allowed himself a small smile. He wasn't dealing with a broken woman hiding in silence. He was dealing with someone extraordinary, someone who carried the same echoes of training he did. And though she gave no outward acknowledgement, he sensed she recognized him too. In the way, her eyes lingered just a second longer when he passed. In the slight narrowing of her gaze when he tested her reflexes, in the subtle tension that hummed between them during therapy sessions. It was as though they were speaking a language no one else could hear. A language built not of words, but of recognition. One afternoon, he decided to push the unspoken dialogue further. Instead of giving her step-by-step instructions, he simply demonstrated a sequence of movements, the kind of physical drill he knew she'd recognize. Without hesitation, she mirrored him perfectly, down to the smallest detail. Her body moved with the efficiency of someone who had drilled these motions countless times before. When she finished, she met his gaze for the briefest of moments. For the first time since she arrived, her eyes didn't just observe, they acknowledged. It was fleeting, but Jake understood. The other staff remained oblivious, still treating her like a patient, defined by silence. They praised her determination, admiring her composure without understanding the roots of it. But Jake saw deeper. He knew silence wasn't her weakness, it was her shield. And behind that shield was a history she wasn't ready to reveal. Still, he didn't press her. He remembered too well what it was like to carry stories too heavy to share, memories locked behind guarded expressions. Instead, he respected the silence, meeting it with his own. When others tried to draw her out with chatter, he simply stood beside her, steady and patient. Where they saw a wall, he saw a choice. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet understanding between them deepened. During one particularly grueling session, when she struggled against the limits of her healing body, Jake caught the faintest flicker of frustration cross her face. Not weakness frustration. And in that moment, he whispered something no one else could hear. Don't fight the pain. Work with it. Her eyes snapped to his, surprise flashing there for the first time. It was advice no ordinary medic would give. It was the kind of counsel born from the brutal training of those who had endured the impossible. For a heartbeat, she seemed ready to respond. Her lips parted ever so slightly, but then she caught herself and turned away. Jake didn't push. But inside, he knew he was right. She wasn't just a patient healing from wounds. She was a soldier in hiding, carrying a story that would one day demand to be told. For now, though, he would wait. He had time, and he knew the truth better than anyone. Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with weapons, but with silence. And she was still fighting hers. By the time Jake had been in the ward for several weeks, he no longer needed confirmation of what he already suspected. The silent woman was no ordinary patient. Her posture, her breathing, her reflexes, every detail spoke of training that only a select few ever endured. Still, observation alone was not enough. If he wanted to know the depth of her discipline, he needed to see it tested. Jake was cautious, though. He understood that pushing too hard could fracture the fragile trust forming between them. He didn't want to expose her secret carelessly, or force her into retreat. So he began with small, almost imperceptible adjustments during therapy sessions, alterations so subtle that the other staff would never notice. One morning, as she prepared for balance drills, Jake shifted the placement of the support rail an inch farther than usual. For the average patient, the difference would be negligible, but for someone with precise muscle memory, it would demand instinctive correction. As she stepped forward, her weight faltered only for a fraction of a second before her body adjusted smoothly. To anyone else, it looked like steady progress. But Jake saw it for what it was: perfect adaptation. Encouraged, he introduced more variations. He lengthened her repetitions beyond the norm, slowed the pacing of exercises until her patience should have frayed, and introduced controlled instability by applying subtle pressure during her movements. Each time, she responded with uncanny precision. She didn't merely endure the challenges, she mastered them. What fascinated Jake most was not her body's reaction, but her face. She never betrayed the frustration or exhaustion most patients displayed. Instead, her expression remained calm, almost detached, as though the pain and effort were simply part of a larger mission. That composure reminded him of countless teammates who had endured the same grueling training. Never show weakness, never reveal discomfort, and always push forward. It was during one of these sessions that Jake decided to test her reflexes outright. As she rose from her chair, balancing with effort, he let a weight slip from his hand, not heavy enough to injure, but loud enough to startle. The crash echoed across the room. Patients nearby flinched, some gasped, others turned curiously. She, however, did something no one expected. Her body dropped instinctively into a defensive crouch. Despite her injuries, she lowered her center of gravity, one hand instinctively curling into a fist, while the other reached for a weapon that wasn't there. Her eyes scanned the room with a sharpness that froze Jake in place. For 2 seconds, the ward ceased to exist as a place of healing. It became a battlefield in her mind. Then, just as quickly, the mask returned. She straightened, adjusted her bandages, and continued as if nothing had happened. The other patients muttered about how she'd simply been startled, but Jake knew the truth. That wasn't startle, it was training. Later that evening, he replayed the moment in his mind. The stance, the precision, the reaction time, he had seen them all before, drilled into his brothers and sisters during BUDS training and combat tours. For her to respond like that, she had endured something similar. Maybe not SEAL training, but something equally unforgiving. The following day, Jake raised the difficulty again. This time, he guided her through resistance band exercises, deliberately shifting the tension without warning. She didn't falter. She absorbed the change seamlessly, her muscles adjusting before her conscious mind could catch up. When he increased the load beyond what most patients could tolerate, she endured silently, sweat rolling down her face, but her breathing perfectly controlled. Afterward, when he offered her water, she met his eyes briefly. It was the first time her gaze seemed to carry something beyond observation, something like recognition. She knew what he was doing, and she wasn't stopping him. Jake began to notice the others reacting too. The staff applauded her rapid progress, chalking it up to sheer determination. "She's a natural," one nurse said. "She's got grit," another added. The patients watched her with admiration that bordered on awe. Where they struggled through simple steps, she executed them with elegance, never breaking under strain. Yet Jake sensed the truth. She wasn't just determined. She was conditioned. One afternoon, while leading her through a particularly grueling series of stretches, he decided to confront her indirectly. "You know," he said casually, "most people don't adapt like you do. Most people fight the exercises, resist the pain. Like you let it move through you." She didn't respond, of course. She never did. But her eyes flickered, just slightly acknowledging his words. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't dismissal either. It was the closest thing to communication he had gotten from her. Over the next week, Jake continued testing, pushing the boundaries of her silence. He introduced military-style endurance drills disguised as rehabilitation exercises, monitored how she conserved energy, and studied her micro-reactions under stress. Each day confirmed his suspicion. She was trained, disciplined, and far more capable than she let anyone believe. The final confirmation came during a group therapy session. Patients were gathered for a cooperative exercise designed to foster teamwork. A ball was passed from one to another, each required to balance on one foot before tossing it along. When it reached her, a younger patient fumbled his catch, sending the ball rolling toward the edge of the ward. Without hesitation, she moved not with the slow, careful pace expected of someone recovering, but with sharp, tactical precision. She intercepted the ball before it hit the floor, balanced herself on one leg with perfect control, and returned it seamlessly. The room went quiet. Even the therapists paused, stunned. To them, it was simply an impressive recovery. To Jake, it was undeniable proof. Only someone with combat reflexes could have executed that movement flawlessly, while injured, without hesitation. After the session, Jake approached her. He didn't accuse, didn't demand answers. Instead, he simply said, "You've done this before, haven't you?" For the first time, she looked directly at him, her silence heavier than words. She didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't flinch. But in her gaze, Jake saw confirmation. She knew that he knew. And that knowledge created a silent bond between them, stronger than any conversation could have built. From that day forward, Jake no longer tested her to prove himself right. Instead, he tested her to remind her of what she already carried inside: strength, discipline, survival. And though she remained silent, he could see the shift in her posture, the faint spark in her eyes. She knew her secret was no longer hers alone. Someone had recognized, it recognized her. For the first time since she entered the ward, she was no longer alone in her silence. The ward had grown accustomed to her silence. Patients admired her from afar, staff respected her discipline, and Jake, the SEAL medic, carried his suspicions quietly. For weeks he had tested her, stretching the limits of her recovery, observing reactions that no ordinary patient could have given. She had revealed fragments of herself through movement, through instinct, through reflexes honed in shadows, but never through words. Until one day, the silence cracked. It began during an afternoon therapy session. The room was lit with the warm glow of fading sunlight, its beams filtering through the tall hospital windows. Patients shuffled between parallel bars, walkers, and resistance bands. The air buzzed with a low hum of encouragement, laughter, and the occasional grunt of pain. Amidst it all, she stood at the far corner, working through a series of balance exercises Jake had designed for her subtle challenges disguised as rehabilitation. She was steady, almost too steady, her movements precise, even though her body trembled from the strain. Jake stood nearby, watching carefully, pretending to jot notes while his eyes stayed fixed on her. Something in him told him that today would be different. He introduced the final test without warning. As she shifted her weight forward, he extended a resistance band toward her, creating tension that forced her to adjust quickly or risk falling. Most patients would panic, stumble, perhaps even cry out for help. But she didn't. She absorbed the resistance, dropped her stance, and executed a perfect counterbalance as though it had been rehearsed 1,000 times. The room fell into silence for a brief second. The therapist on the other side blinked in surprise. "That was?" he began, but Jake cut him off gently. "That was trained," Jake finished, his voice calm but firm. The woman froze, her eyes darting to his. For the first time since her arrival, Her composure cracked, not visibly, not to anyone else, but enough for Jake to see it. Her jaw tightened, her breath caught, and the faintest flicker of recognition passed between them. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You've done this before," he said softly. "I know training when I see it. Where you learned it. That's your story. But don't think I can't recognize it." For a moment, the entire world seemed to pause. She stared at him, her silence now heavy with conflict. Her eyes, usually guarded, now shimmered with something else. Fear? Relief? Maybe both. The weight of unspoken years hung between them. Then it happened. Her lips parted ever so slightly, and in a voice hoarse from disuse, she whispered, "You see too much." The words were barely audible, but to Jake, they struck like thunder. Around them, the ward carried on patients groaning, therapists encouraging, but to him, nothing else existed. He had finally heard her voice. It was quiet, raw, but strong in a way only truth could be. Jake didn't smile, didn't push further. He simply nodded, his own voice steady. "That's because I've lived it." Her eyes narrowed, studying him as if to measure the depth of his understanding. He didn't flinch under her scrutiny. He had spent his life surrounded by warriors, by those who bore their pain in silence. He knew that recognition, that guarded vulnerability. The session ended, but the air in the ward felt different. Word spread quickly among staff and patients that the silent woman had finally spoken, just a single sentence, but enough to ignite a storm of curiosity. Nurses buzzed with excitement, therapists speculated about her past, and patients whispered theories late into the night. Some insisted she must have been special forces. Others thought she was a covert operative. A few simply shook their heads in awe, saying, "No wonder she carried herself like that." But for Jake, the revelation was not about gossip. It was about confirmation. He had seen her resilience, her precision, her discipline, and now he had proof. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was forged in fire. Over the next days, she allowed fragments of her past to surface, not through long stories, but through small admissions, gestures, and the way she responded when Jake asked quiet questions. During one therapy session, as they practiced controlled falls, he murmured, "You learned this in survival school, didn't you?" She didn't answer with words, but the faintest curve of her lips was enough. Another time, as she corrected her own stance before he could, Jake said, "You know how to teach this as well as I do." Her gaze lingered on him, steady and knowing, before she turned back to her exercises. To the others, these exchanges seemed like ordinary therapy. To Jake, they were confirmations pieces of a puzzle slowly falling into place. What surprised him most, however, was the reaction of those around her. The moment her training was revealed, admiration replaced pity. The patients who once whispered about her strangeness now looked at her with reverence. "She's one of us," said the elderly veteran, pride in his voice. "No, she's more," another corrected. "She's proof that we can come back from anything." The staff, too, shifted their perspective. They no longer saw her as fragile. Instead, they adjusted their approach, treating her as an equal in resilience rather than a patient defined by wounds. She had, without speeches or declarations, transformed the ward simply by revealing the truth of who she was. For her, the revelation was bittersweet. On one hand, it freed her from the weight of secrecy. For the first time since her injuries, she no longer had to pretend she was just another broken soul. But on the other hand, it left her vulnerable. The silence that had shielded her now cracked open, and with it came questions, expectations, and memories she wasn't ready to face. Yet through it all, Jake remained steady. He didn't pry. He didn't demand answers. Instead, he stayed beside her, guiding her recovery with the quiet understanding of someone who knew the cost of survival. And in the small, rare moments when she allowed herself to speak, it was always to him. One evening, as the ward grew quiet and the lights dimmed, she whispered again, almost too softly to hear. "I wasn't supposed to survive." Jake looked at her, his voice calm and firm. "But you did. And that makes all the difference." Her gaze held his for a long moment, and in that silence she realized something profound. For the first time since her world had shattered, she wasn't alone in carrying it. And though she still spoke little, the revelation had been enough. Her silence was no longer misunderstood as weakness. It was recognized for what it had always been, strength. A strength that had amazed everyone, not because of the scars she bore, but because of the story she had finally begun to tell. The ward was never the same after that day. Word spread quickly. The silent woman had spoken, and more importantly, her movements and instincts revealed that she was no ordinary survivor. She wasn't just another patient recovering from injury, she was something far greater. At first, it started as whispers. Patients exchanged knowing looks, murmuring in corners about the way she had caught the falling ball, the way she had held her stance under impossible strain. Nurses smiled a little wider when they approached her, their voices tinged with awe. Even the therapists, people accustomed to resilience in all its forms, treated her progress with a quiet reverence, as though every step she took carried a weight of legend. But admiration didn't stop at the staff and patients. Visitors noticed too. Family members waiting in the lobby caught glimpses of her as she moved through exercises. And soon stories trickled out. "There's a woman in there who's built like iron. They say she doesn't talk, but she doesn't need to. You should see the way she moves, like she was trained for war." Shock and admiration swirled together, and in its wake, the ward transformed. A new kind of leader. She hadn't asked to be a leader. She hadn't spoken more than a few words, hadn't raised her hand to guide others. Yet people began to look to her instinctively. When group exercises grew too difficult, patients watched how she carried herself, then mirrored her steadiness. When exhaustion set in, they measured their strength against her silent example. If she could endure without complaint, then so could they. One afternoon, during a particularly grueling therapy session, an older veteran faltered midway through his steps. He shook his head, breathless, muttering that he couldn't do it. Before any therapist could intervene, she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she crossed the room, her gait still uneven but controlled. Without a word, she placed her hand lightly on his shoulder and held his gaze. No pep talk, no dramatic gesture, just presence. The old man straightened, tightened his grip on the rail, and took another step. Then another. Around them, the room fell quiet, every patient drawing strength from the silent exchange. By the time he reached the end of the exercise, sweat poured down his face, but he was smiling. "She makes you believe you can," he whispered afterward. Even without saying a thing, ripples of respect-admiration came with curiosity. Patients speculated endlessly about her past. Some were convinced she had served in the military, others imagined intelligence work, while a few swore she must have been part of something even more secretive. Jake, the SEAL medic, remained the only one who knew enough to understand. He didn't correct the rumors, didn't add to them. Instead, he let the mystery fuel their respect. He knew the truth wasn't his to tell. Still, the effect on morale was undeniable. People pushed harder in their therapy sessions. They compared notes, encouraged one another, and even challenged themselves to do it like her. She had unknowingly become the standard, the bar everyone aspired to reach. And though she never asked for it, she accepted it with grace. Not by stepping into the role of leader, but by being herself disciplined, resilient, and unshuckable. The power of silent shock gave way to admiration, and admiration slowly became dependence. Patients began waiting for her to arrive before starting group activities. They asked her to demonstrate exercises, even when she hadn't been assigned to. Therapists, recognizing the effect she had, sometimes let her lead stretches, not with words, but with actions the others could follow. She never complained. She never sought attention. But her silence, once seen as strange, became her greatest strength. People projected their own battles onto it, finding courage in her quiet. For one young soldier recovering from shrapnel wounds, her presence was proof that pain could be endured. For a mother regaining mobility after an accident, she was a reminder that determination could outlast despair. For Jake, she was a reflection of everything he had once believed about the human spirit. That true warriors fight battles no one sees. The price of admiration, but admiration carried weight. With every look of awe, with every whispered theory, she felt the pressure mounting. She had spent months, years, even hiding her truth, burying her training beneath silence. Now it had been unearthed, and there was no way to put it back. At night, when the ward grew quiet, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the memories she had tried to lock away. Missions that had demanded silence. Nights spent in the cold, with nothing but discipline keeping her alive. Friends lost, battles endured, scars carried inside and out. She had survived because she had buried it all. And now, simply by revealing a fraction of who she was, she found herself carrying not only her own weight, but the expectations of everyone around her. Jake noticed it first. The slight heaviness in her shoulders. The way her eyes lingered on the ground a little longer after sessions. He recognized the signs of someone burdened by more than recovery. Late one evening, as the last of the patients drifted back to their rooms, Jake approached her quietly. "They look up to you," he said softly. "But that doesn't mean you have to carry them." She glanced at him, her silence returning. For a moment, Jake wondered if she would retreat again. But then she gave the faintest shake of her head. Not denial, acknowledgement. She understood the weight. She simply wasn't sure if she could put it down. A living symbol over the following weeks, admiration deepened into something almost spiritual. Patients spoke of her as though she embodied the very essence of survival. Nurses nicknamed her the Iron Woman. One therapist jokingly called her our drill sergeant, though the humor was laced with respect. Even visitors who had never met her directly carried stories of her beyond the ward. "There's a woman in there," they'd say. "She barely talks, but she inspires everyone just by standing up." And perhaps that was the truest measure of her impact. She had not set out to lead, to teach, or to inspire. She had only set out to endure. But in doing so, she revealed a truth that resonated with everyone who saw her. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and unyielding. Shocked, transformed. By the time she completed her latest round of exercises, walking the length of the ward, unassisted applause erupted. Not polite clapping, not the routine encouragement given to patients, but genuine, thunderous applause. Every patient, every nurse, every therapist stood, their admiration spilling out in cheers. She paused, caught off guard. Her instinct was to retreat, to sink back into silence. But when she looked up, she saw their faces filled not with pity, but with pride. They weren't applauding her as a patient. They were celebrating her as proof of what was possible. For the first time in months, something stirred inside her. A small, fragile flame she had thought extinguished. Hope. The ward had come to accept her silence as part of who she was. It was no longer seen as a weakness, nor as a mystery to be solved. It was her identity, the quiet strength that defined her presence. Yet silence, no matter how disciplined, cannot hold forever. For weeks, her admirers had carried her on a pedestal. They saw her as untouchable, unbreakable, the embodiment of resilience itself. But Jake, the SEAL medic, knew better. He had seen what they hadn't. The heaviness in her gaze, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her silence sometimes looked less like choice and more like chains. He knew that silence could be armor. But armor, if worn too long, becomes a prison. A storm inside it happened on a rainy evening, when the ward echoed with the sound of thunder outside. The patients had gathered in the common area for group exercises. Some were stretching, others working on breathing techniques. She was there too, silent as always, her movements smooth and precise. Then a sound split the room. A tray slipped from a nurse's hands, crashing to the floor with a metallic clang. Most patients jumped at the noise, some even laughed nervously. But for her, it was different. In an instant, her body dropped low, her stance sharp, her eyes scanning the room like a soldier under fire. Her breath came fast, her fists clenched, her muscles tensed as though she were back on a battlefield no one else could see. The room froze. Patients stared, wide-eyed. Nurses exchanged anxious glances. Jake moved first. He knelt in front of her, his voice low but steady. "You're safe," he said. "It's not a fight. It's just a tray." Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Her eyes darted to his, filled with a storm she could no longer hide. And then finally, the silence shattered. The first break, "I can't." Her voice cracked, raw, almost foreign after so long unused. "I can't turn it off." Gasps rippled through the room. Patients who had never heard her speak leaned forward in stunned silence. Nurses stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or simply listen. Jake didn't flinch. His tone stayed calm. "You're not supposed to turn it off. You're supposed to learn how to carry it." Her fists trembled. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. "I wasn't supposed to survive. They told me." She stopped, shaking her head. "I was supposed to finish the mission, not end up here." It was the most anyone had ever heard her say. And it hit the room like a wave. Reactions for the patients. It was shock unlike anything before. They had built an image of her as iron, unshakable and silent. To see her voice crack, to hear her admit her fears, it broke something inside them, but not in the way they expected. It didn't make her weaker in their eyes. It made her real. One woman, recovering from a car accident, whispered to another, "She's just like us. She's human." Another patient, a young soldier with bandaged legs, clenched his fists, tears in his eyes. "She's fought battles I can't even imagine. And she's still here." That strength, the admiration in the ward shifted. It wasn't just about awe anymore, it was about connection. A new kind of courage in the days that followed. Her words came more often, though still carefully, as though each one carried the weight of her past. Sometimes it was only a sentence during therapy. Sometimes a whisper at night when the ward was quiet. She admitted small fragments. The training that had broken her body and rebuilt it. The missions that had demanded silence. The faces of comrades she would never see again. She never gave names, never revealed details that might compromise her vows. But the essence was clear. She had lived through fire and carried the scars no one could see. Jake was always there, guiding her through each revelation with patience. He never pushed for more than she could give. When she faltered, he reminded her, words aren't weakness. Sometimes they're survival. And slowly, she believed him. The ripple effect, her breaking silence had a ripple effect on the ward. Patients who once kept their pain bottled up began to share more openly. A man who had lost his arm in an explosion admitted his fear of never holding his daughter again. A mother recovering from surgery confessed her guilt over needing help. Inspired by her courage, they spoke and found healing in the process. The therapists noticed the change immediately. Group sessions grew richer, filled with honesty rather than polite restraint. The atmosphere of the ward shifted from quiet endurance to collective strength. And at the center of it all was the woman who had once refused to speak. A private moment. One evening, Jake found her sitting alone near the window, watching rain streak down the glass. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes carried the same storm he had seen before. "You broke the silence," he said gently. She glanced at him, lips pressing together. For a moment, he thought she might retreat again. But then she whispered, "It feels strange. Like I'm betraying something." Jake shook his head. "You're not betraying anything. Silence served you once. But here, it doesn't have to. Here, your words don't compromise you. They free you." She looked at him for a long moment, then finally nodded. A small step, but one that meant more than any stride she had taken across the therapy floor. Becoming whole by the end of the week, she was no longer just the silent woman. She had become the voice of courage in the ward. Not because she spoke often, but because when she did, her words carried the weight of truth. She didn't give speeches, didn't recite long stories. Instead, she shared fragments, small, powerful admissions that pierced through the silence of others. And with each word, she grew lighter, as though the burden of silence she had carried for so long was finally beginning to lift. The turning point, the shock of her speaking had given way to admiration of a new kind. It wasn't about her strength alone, or her training, or even her survival. It was about her willingness to be vulnerable, to reveal that beneath the iron was a human heart that beat just like everyone else's. And in that revelation, she became something more than a symbol. She became hope itself. The ward had changed. What once had been a place of quiet suffering and tentative recovery had become something else entirely. Patients no longer looked at her with confusion or fear. They looked at her with respect, awe, and even gratitude. Staff who had once whispered about her unusual discipline now walked taller, inspired by the example she had unknowingly set. And through it all, she had changed too, not just in body, but in spirit. For months, she had carried her silence like armor, a shield against the memories that haunted her. It had protected her, yes, but it had also isolated her. Through careful observation, relentless testing, and patient guidance, Jake, the SEAL medic who understood more than anyone else, had shown her that strength did not require invisibility. Sometimes, strength demanded acknowledgement, connection, and even words. Now she spoke more freely, not with ease, and never unnecessarily, but with intention. Each phrase she uttered carried the weight of her past, the lessons of survival, and the wisdom she had earned in silence. Words were no longer chains. They were tools she could use to reach others, to guide them, and to heal alongside them. The ward as a classroom, it began subtly. During therapy sessions, she would demonstrate exercises for those struggling, sometimes offering a whispered tip to correct posture or technique. Patients who had once doubted themselves now followed her lead with trust. A young man recovering from a spinal injury mimicked her stance, balancing with a confidence that surprised even the therapists. "They call her a drill sergeant now," a nurse said with a grin one afternoon, watching the ward come alive. "But she doesn't demand obedience. She inspires it, and she did. Every movement she made was intentional, every word carefully measured, yet the effect was immediate. Those around her began to understand that resilience was not an abstract concept. It was something to be embodied, something to be practiced daily. A mentor emerges. Jake watched her grow into her role with quiet pride. He had known from the first day that she was trained, disciplined, and extraordinary. But he also knew that extraordinary people often struggle with belonging. She had survived alone for so long that connection was unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Yet she was learning. Each small conversation, each acknowledgement of others' struggles, drew her closer to the ward community. She became a mentor, not in a formal sense, but through example and subtle guidance. Patients sought her out for advice, not just for exercises, but for courage. "How do you endure?" they would ask quietly. She didn't lecture. She didn't over-explain. She demonstrated, and her presence alone answered the question. Facing the shadows despite her progress, the past still lingered. Memories of missions, training, loss, and survival remained etched in her mind. Some nights, she would sit by the window, staring into darkness, reliving the moments she had buried deep beneath her silence. It was painful, but she no longer faced it alone. Jake often joined her, a quiet presence beside the window. "You've carried enough," he would say softly. "Now, let it guide you instead of control you." At first, she hesitated. She had survived by controlling every detail, by remaining silent, by suppressing emotion. But gradually, she began to let her experiences fuel something new. Purpose. Her strength, honed in hardship, could now serve not only herself but others. A vision for the future. One morning, after observing a group therapy session, she made a decision. The ward had given her safety, support, and space to heal. It had also given her insight. Her experience, her discipline, resilience, and survival was valuable beyond herself. She could use it to train, guide, and inspire others who faced physical and emotional battles. Jake noticed the change immediately. "You're thinking bigger," he said quietly. She nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "It's time I give back. I can't keep everything I've learned to myself." Plans began to take shape. She envisioned programs for patients recovering from trauma, workshops for veterans, mentorship initiatives for those struggling with fear, pain, or loss. Her approach would be holistic, blending discipline with empathy, training with emotional support. She had seen firsthand how inspiration could transform people, and now she intended to channel that power deliberately. Transforming inspiration into action, the patients and staff continued to look up to her, but now they were more than admirers, they were participants in her vision. She guided group exercises, demonstrated coping strategies, and shared her story in carefully measured fragments. She revealed the reality of endurance, that resilience was not absence of fear or pain, but mastery over it. The ward itself became a microcosm of the future she imagined, a place where strength and vulnerability coexisted, where people learned from example, and where hope was tangible. The ripple effect was clear. Patients who had once struggled to take a single step forward now walked with confidence, inspired by her persistence. Recognition and respect over time, even the most skeptical staff began to acknowledge her influence. Doctors who had once viewed her as merely a patient marveled at the transformation in the ward's atmosphere. Therapists noted that patients seemed more motivated, more resilient, and more willing to engage, largely because of her example. Jake, too, recognized the change, not just in others, but in her. She had moved from silence to speech, from isolation to leadership, and from survival to purpose. And she had done it without losing the discipline, precision, and strength that had defined her all along. The final lesson, her journey culminated in a quiet afternoon, standing before the ward one last time before her discharge. Patients gathered, not out of obligation, but out of respect and admiration. She spoke softly, each word deliberate. Strength is not measured by what you endure alone. It is measured by what you do with what you've survived. Today, you are stronger than you know. Keep moving forward. Keep helping each other. And never forget that silence is powerful, but connection is stronger. No applause, no fanfare, just the steady gaze of those whose lives she had touched. Yet the impact was profound. A new beginning. As she left the ward, she felt a lightness she hadn't known for years. The weight of her silence had lifted. She carried her past not as a burden, but as a foundation. And ahead of her lay a mission not of survival alone, but of service, inspiration, and purpose. Jake followed her to the exit. "Ready for the next chapter?" he asked. She looked out at the horizon, breathing in the fresh air with a steady rhythm she had mastered over months of healing. "Yes," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "It's time." And with that, the woman who had arrived, wounded and wordless, stepped into the world anew, not as a patient, not as a mystery, but as a leader, a mentor, and a beacon of resilience. Her story, once silent, would now continue to inspire countless others, proving that survival was not the end, but the beginning of a mission greater than oneself.